This presentation is entitled Temper's Flair, a temperance bishop, a monk, and a brewery. What could go wrong there? So the characters involved are Father Boniface Wimmer, OSB, the founder of the American Cassinese Congregation of Benedictines and the first person to found a Benedictine monastery in the United States, which eventually became St. Vincent's Monastery and St. Vincent's Archabbey. And the other character involved is Michael O'Connor, the first bishop of Pittsburgh, who at the time was the bishop in the ordinary for the area in which Father Wimmer had his monastery. So let's take a look at their backgrounds. Father Boniface Wimmer was born in 1809 and was initially ordained for the Diocese of Regensburg in Germany. You guys remember the Regensburg Psalter. In 1831. Now this is the time when the monasteries were closed, primarily coming out of the Napoleonic Wars. Not all of them had reopened. When the monastery of Metten opened in 1832, Father Wimmer joined. So we can see here a little map of Germany. And if we look in on the close-up, we can see where Metten is actually located. We can see that this is the Bavaria region, a region known for its beers and actually has some of the oldest continuously operated breweries, run by Benedictines, mind you, in the world, dating back to the 1040s and 1060s. These actually survived the closing from the Napoleonic War because they were considered valuable. We also see a picture of the exterior of Metten and the interior of Metten. And we can see it's a very Baroque style in the German Baroque monasterian structure. Very affluent. So, in 1846, Father Wimmer and 18 others left a pack boat entitled Iowa from Rotterdam. If you guys remember, Rotterdam was one of the major places which the Germans left to come to the New World. And it was very well organized by King Ludwig II and the Mischoven Society. None of Father Wimmer's people had spent a day in the monastery except for Father Wimmer. And by this time, even though he had entered in the 1830s, he had been out and about a lot, studying this, studying that, getting permission to do this, getting permission to do that. And he had really spent very little time himself in the monastery. But he was still a solemnly professed monk. 4 of his followers were students for the priesthood, and the other 14 were candidates for the lay brotherhood. Have to remember, prior to Vatican II, we had the tradition in the Benedictine order of the clerics and the lay brothers, the ones who did the farm work. After a difficult voyage of 28 days, he eventually landed September 15th, 1846, in the Newark, New Jersey area. So he first went to an area called Cambria County. We can see in the one slide, it is the map on the far left. It's also the larger map in the upper right, the zoom in. This area is a very rural area to begin with, but he eventually bluffed the bishop into giving him a place in Latrobe. He said that Cambria County, the land was too poor for farming, which, given that it still is a farmland today, is perplexing, and that the weather was too cold and just bad for the monks. So he bluffed the bishop and said that if he didn't get a better parcel of land, he would take up an offer from the Diocese of Chicago to go to Chicago. Now, he would eventually send monks to Chicago, but at this time he had yet to receive an invitation. So he bluffed his way. This would be the first bluff of many for our lovely founder. But he did get the parish of St. Vincent's, and it was a diocesan parish, and it still is a diocese parish. It's a rare fluke in the Benedictine order for them to own the parish. But it is a parish of the diocese. Then of Pittsburgh, now of Greensburg. So, the other main character is Bishop O'Connor. Now, he was an Irish bishop. He was born in Ireland and to an upper-standing family. He was the first bishop of Pittsburgh and a member of the Catholic temperance movement, which is important to note because the Pittsburgh area, especially at that time, was a major temperance city. It had huge resources, the Methodist Temperance Society, the Women's Temperance League, many different temperance societies worked out of Pittsburgh. Partly because it was a hard-working city. It was a steel mill, even back then, though not fully as it would be under Carnegie, but it was starting to truly develop. And with the railroads that will eventually come, it will become a hard-working steel mill town, known for its drinking and known for its fighting. But Bishop O'Connor was against that. He felt the stereotypes of the Irish ill-served the Irish, and as Irishman himself, he did not like to be considered a drunkard. So he was a very, very active member of the Catholic temperance movement. So what happens with the brewery? So it was originally owned by Father Wimmer's nephew, who bought it using a loan from Father Boniface Wimmer from personal funds, and it made and sold beer. Now, what's important to note is it sold it wholesale and by the pint. It sold it wholesale from the brewery, meaning in the keg or barrel, which was 32 gallons, not the standard 16 we now have in the United States, but 32 at a clip, and by the pint in the tavern. Now, this brewery and tavern was located in Indiana, Pennsylvania, which you can see the county highlighted, which is one county up from Latrobe and one county to the left from Cambria County. So you can see it's sort of in the middle, and it's 25 miles away from the Abbey. And it should be noted that Indiana, Pennsylvania is still known for its beer today, and just this year was ranked the top college town in the United States for beer lovers because of its drinkability, its prices being low, and its just friendly atmosphere. Great place to visit. I did studies there. So the development of the dispute. So Wimmer's nephew welched on the debt, so to speak. He couldn't pay it back. So the debt required to be reclaimed. So Wimmer took control of the monastery, not the monastery, but of the brewery. The problem came in that being that the monastery was still a priory and that the United States was still considered missionary territory, it fell under the jurisdiction and oversight of the bishop. Now, the bishop's oversight was mainly to prevent Father Wimmer from just accepting anybody to get the number of monks required for a canonically erect abbey. But the bishop did have technical oversight. And problems would develop with that oversight with two main characters, Father Peter Lemke, who was a diocesan priest, and Oswald Moosmiller, who was actually a full-fledged Benedictine. Now, Father Lemke will want to go to Gethsemane Abbey, and Father Moosmiller will want to go out west. Both of which the bishop will grant, eventually, overruling Father Wimmer, who said, no, stay here if you want to stay here. Father Lemke at the time had sought to join the Benedictines, and Father Moosmiller had already. So the argument changes, which is interesting to see from the personal correspondence of Father Wimmer. He initially says that he intends to sell the brewery, but for the sake of the monastery, he cannot lose money on the issue. And this is coming in 1849. Then we get the Lemke incident. And 1853 rolls around early in the year, and you get the argument changing from I intend to sell but to I intend to sell but the railroad workers really enjoy the beer, and good beer is hard to come by. And isn't it better that the Irish railroad workers drink beer instead of whiskey? This way they won't fight as much. Interesting argument. Then we get the Oswald Moosmiller incident, where the bishop uses his oversight, much to Father Wimmer's anger. And we get beer is good for the older monk's digestion, and good beer is very hard to find in the United States. So even though I intend to sell the brewery, it might be best if we still do brew some beer for the monks. I understand selling the tavern, but the beer itself could be good. Important side note to note here, again, the issue was the water. This is before the era of purification and chlorinization, so it did take time to get accustomed to new water flora, and some of these monks were not the best of health to begin with. So beer could have been a legitimate argument. But this argument very quickly changes to a very stern one, which is stereotypical for Father Wimmer. And it becomes, I refuse to be bound in America by any law, and he means canon law, by any law that would not bind me in Bavaria, or that I would not be bound by in Bavaria. So he throws down the gauntlet. And it is interesting to see, because he, in the same letter where he says he refuses to be bound by any law, says to the Bishop O'Connor that he will press his cause with the Holy Father and the Holy See, and that he will go to Europe to have King Ludwig assist him. And he did. So Boniface Wimmer goes to Europe first to see his patron, Ludwig II, who was the founder of the Mischoven Society and was the one who brought Father Wimmer to the United States. And King Ludwig uses his diplomat in the Holy See, which is the formal title for actually the Holy Father, but what was then the Papal Estates, and more importantly by this time becoming very quickly Vatican City only, to press the case, as did Bishop O'Connor, who used a couple cardinal friends to press his rights. All in all, the Pope did make his decision, and the Pope decided that the monks have the right to brew beer. Important wording, because the letter actually does say that they have the right. It's not a privilege. It's a right. But that they could not sell it wholesale. Correction. But they could not sell it by the pint. They had to sell it wholesale. The reason for that is simply they didn't want, the Holy Father didn't want the monks using a tavern. I mean, they thought it ill and bad and contributing to the downfall of society. So they could sell it wholesale. What's important to note is by this time Father Wimmer had already sold the brewery and the tavern because he was offered a very fair price for it, and this became just an exercise of his stubbornness. But you eventually do get respect on both sides. So Wimmer did sell the tavern, as I said, in Indiana, and he did not build a new one until O'Connor resigned from his bishop seat to actually become a Jesuit. And it's a hilarious story because he didn't tell his novitiate classmates that he was a former bishop. They knew he was a priest, but his superiors were the only ones who knew. Until he was saying Mass, and at the end of Mass he gave the pontifical blessing, which is reserved only for a major superior or a bishop. And from what all the accounts say, his classmates nearly had a heart attack. And O'Connor, conversely, being that Wimmer had already gotten rid of the brewery, gave St. Vincent Parish to Boniface Wimmer and the abbots of St. Vincent's in perpetuity. So the abbot of St. Vincent's monastery, the archabbey, the archabbot is always the pastor of St. Vincent's, and St. Vincent's is a diocesan parish. Important to note, St. Vincent's did keep the brewery until Prohibition came, and with the passage of Prohibition in the United States, they, being law-abiding citizens, stopped brewing beer, at least publicly. Then, when Prohibition ended, they did not reopen. There was always speculation that Rolling Rock, which soon reopened after Prohibition in Latrobe, was the monastery beer and the beer recipe, but that has never been proven, and the archives on that matter are sealed, and even though I was granted access to the letters, there were certain aspects of the St. Vincent's archive that even I was close to. So, that ends our presentation on the monk and the temperance bishop.